Officer Ryan Matthews had done this countless times before. Another traffic stop, another black driver, another excuse to flex his authority. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly imagined, was that this time he had just picked the wrong man. As the flashing red and blue lights filled the darkening highway, Darius Cole remained calm behind the wheel of his SUV. He had faced real threats before, on battlefields, in life-or-death situations, but this was nothing new. He had dealt with men like Matthews before, men who mistook their badge for unchecked power. But tonight, things would be different. Tonight, Matthews would learn a lesson he would never forget. The officer approached, his voice filled with forced authority, license and registration. But as Darius reached for his wallet, he already knew this wasn't going to be a normal traffic stop. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more powerful stories. Darius Cole kept his hands steady as he reached for his wallet, moving slowly, not out of fear, but out of habit. He had been in situations like this before. He knew the routine, knew exactly how officers like Ryan Matthews operated. They wanted control, wanted submission. But Darius wasn't built that way. Years of military service had taught him discipline, patience, and most importantly, how to handle men who mistook power for authority. As he pulled out his license and registration, he glanced up, studying the man standing outside his window. Matthew's stance, his narrowed eyes, the way his fingers rested just a little too close to his holster. Darius had seen it all before. This wasn't about the law. This was about control. Officer Ryan Matthews thrived on that control. In his 10 years on the force, he had developed a reputation, one that never made it to official reports but was well known among the community. He didn't just enforce the law, he bent it to his will, pulling over drivers he deemed suspicious, which always seemed to mean the same thing. Tonight was no different. He had barely glanced at Darius's plates before flipping on his sirens. No traffic violation, no real reason, just a hunch. And now, as he looked at the man inside the SUV, something about him felt different. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't fumbling for excuses or pleading like some of the others had. He was just sitting there, too calm, too controlled. It irritated him. The stretch of highway was quiet, only a few cars passing now and then. The last traces of sunlight cast long shadows across the road, the flickering glow of streetlights just beginning to illuminate the pavement. It was the kind of place where an officer like Matthews felt invincible. No witnesses, no one to question his authority. He leaned down, peering into the vehicle. "Step out of the car." The words weren't a request. They were a demand, laced with the confidence of someone who expected immediate obedience. Darius exhaled slowly, his grip tightening slightly on the steering wheel before he let go. He had already predicted this. It didn't matter that he had handed over his license and registration without issue. It didn't matter that he had done nothing wrong. Matthews had made up his mind before he even walked up to the car. Darius had dealt with threats far greater than this man, but he wasn't reckless. He was trained, disciplined, and above all, he understood strategy. He could have argued, could have pointed out that he had broken no laws, but that would have only escalated things. Instead, he moved deliberately, undoing his seatbelt and stepping out with the same measured control that had been drilled into him during years of service. Matthews watched him closely, still expecting some sign of resistance, some excuse to escalate. But it didn't come. Instead, Darius straightened to his full height, towering slightly over the officer. His posture was perfect. his expression unreadable. Matthews swallowed, suddenly feeling something he wasn't used to: unease. Darius held his gaze, his voice calm but firm. "Before you take this any further, officer, I suggest you think very carefully about what you're about to do." The words weren't a threat. They were a warning. But Matthews, blinded by his own arrogance, took them as a challenge. Officer Ryan Matthews narrowed his eyes as Darius stood tall, his presence radiating an unsettling calm. That confidence, that unwavering composure, it infuriated him. In his experience, people always showed fear. They stammered, fumbled for words, avoided eye contact. But this man, he wasn't intimidated. He wasn't defensive. He was looking right at him, like he was in control. Matthews felt his grip tighten on his belt, his fingers hovering near his holster as he took a step closer. "I don't take orders from you," he sneered. "Turn around and put your hands on the car." Darius didn't move. He simply exhaled through his nose, his patience wearing thin. He had given the officer a chance to step back, to de-escalate. But Matthews wasn't interested in reason. This wasn't about enforcing the law, it was about power. Darius had seen men like him before, bullies who mistook authority for dominance. He had encountered them in the military, on foreign soil, in situations where unchecked arrogance had led to deadly consequences. And now, here he was, face to face with another one, this time in his own country, on his own streets. The highway remained eerily quiet, save for the occasional car passing by. The sun had fully set now, and the flashing red and blue lights cast sharp shadows across the pavement. Matthews, still mistaking Darius's restraint for defiance, took another step forward, his chest puffed out. "I said, hands on the car, now!" His tone had shifted, more aggressive, more threatening. He wanted a reaction. He needed an excuse to justify what he had already decided would happen. And when Darius didn't flinch, when he didn't so much as blink, it pushed Matthews over the edge. Without warning, the officer lunged, reaching for Darius's arm in an attempt to force him against the SUV. But the moment his hand made contact, everything changed. Darius moved like a shadow, effortlessly shifting his weight and twisting out of Matthews' grasp with the kind of precision that only came from years of combat training. The officer stumbled forward, caught off guard, his balance momentarily thrown. His eyes widened in shock. He had expected resistance, but not this, not someone who could avoid him so easily. Darius took a slow step back, his voice controlled but carrying an unmistakable edge. "You just made a mistake," he said. His tone quieter now, but somehow even more commanding. Matthews clenched his jaw, his pulse quickening. He had dealt with difficult suspects before, but this was different. He wasn't in control anymore, and for the first time he could feel it. But instead of backing down, his pride roared louder than reason. He reached for his taser, his desperation growing. That was when Darius finally allowed a flicker of warning to cross his face. His muscles tensed. His stance shifted slightly, and suddenly it was clear. Matthews wasn't dealing with just any man. He was dealing with someone far more capable than he could comprehend. And whether he realized it yet or not, he had just stepped into a fight he couldn't win. Officer Matthews' fingers barely grazed his taser before everything changed. In the blink of an eye, Darius moved, not with aggression, not with panic, but with the precision of a man who had spent years mastering control. His grip latched onto Matthews' wrist, firm but not crushing, twisting it just enough to render the officer's weapon useless without causing injury. Matthews gasped, his body jerking instinctively, but it was already too late. With one fluid motion, Darius redirected the officer's momentum, guiding him off balance. Matthews stumbled backward, barely catching himself, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one in control. And he felt it. Darius remained perfectly still, his stance unwavering, his breathing slow and measured. He hadn't fought back, hadn't struck Matthews, hadn't even raised his voice. But in that single, effortless maneuver, he had taken away every ounce of the officer's confidence. "Think before you act, officer," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Because right now, you're seconds away from making the worst mistake of your life." His words weren't a threat. They weren't spoken in anger. They were simply a fact. And that was what made them so terrifying. Matthew's hands clenched into fists as he fought the wave of panic rising in his chest. He had spent years pulling men like Darius over, treating them like they were beneath him, like they had no right to challenge his authority. He was the law. He was in control. But standing here now, staring at the man in front of him, he realized something that sent ice down his spine. Darius didn't see him as a threat. He didn't see him as anything at all. That realization made Matthews snap. "You think you're some kind of tough guy?" he spat, forcing false confidence into his voice. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job." He squared his shoulders, trying to regain even a shred of control. "I don't care who you think you are. You're going to do exactly what I say, or—" Darius didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his back pocket with a deliberate, unhurried motion. Matthew's fingers twitched toward his belt again, but he hesitated. There was something about the way Darius moved, calm, methodical, precise. No wasted motion. No uncertainty. Like a predator that didn't need to prove it was at the top of the food chain. When Darius finally pulled out a small leather case and flipped it open, the moment stretched into eternity. Matthew's eyes landed on the card inside, and suddenly his world tilted on its axis. The emblem, the gold lettering, the unmistakable insignia of the United States Navy, and right beneath it, bold and clear, Navy SEAL. Retired. Matthews took an involuntary step back, his breath catching in his throat. His mind scrambled to process what he was looking at, but the truth slammed into him with the force of a freight train. He hadn't just pulled over some average citizen. He hadn't just tried to intimidate some powerless man who would cower under his authority. No, he had just attempted to bully, harass, and forcibly detain a man who had spent years serving his country. A man who had been trained to survive in the most dangerous combat zones in the world. A man who could have ended this entire encounter in seconds if he had wanted to. Darius tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. His voice, however, carried a weight that Matthews had never heard before. "You wear a badge," he said, his tone slow, deliberate. "I wore one too, but mine wasn't handed to me. I earned it." The weight of the words settled between them like a heavy fog. Matthew's jaw clenched, his breath uneven, his entire body rigid. But the shift in power was undeniable. The man he had tried to push around, the man he had assumed was just another easy target, had flipped the entire situation on its head. And the worst part? He had done it without even raising his voice, without throwing a single punch. Matthews had spent his entire career believing that his badge made him powerful, that it placed him above others, that it gave him the right to control people, to demand obedience. But standing here now, facing a man who had truly earned his rank, his title, his respect, he felt small. Darius let the silence stretch between them, watching the flicker of realization cross the officer's face. Matthews looked down at the military ID again, his fingers twitching, as if debating what to do next. He could still try to salvage this. He could still try to justify himself, to twist the situation in his favor. But deep down, he knew there was no way out of this. No excuse he could give that wouldn't sound like desperate backpedaling. He had been exposed, and he knew it. The once confident officer, the man who had started this entire encounter with arrogance and entitlement, now stood frozen in place. His mind screamed at him to do something, to say anything that could put him back in control. But for the first time in his life, Ryan Matthews understood what it meant to be powerless. Darius let out a slow exhale and placed his ID back into his pocket. His job was done. He had made his point. Without another word, he stepped back toward his vehicle, his movements as smooth and controlled as they had been from the start. Matthews didn't stop him. He couldn't. He just stood there, his pulse pounding in his ears as Darius opened his car door and slid inside. As the engine roared to life, Matthews finally found his voice, but it came out quieter than he had intended. Wait. It wasn't an order this time. It wasn't a demand. It was just a word, a weak, hesitant attempt to hold on to whatever authority he had left. Darius looked at him through the open window, his expression unreadable. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The lesson had already been taught, and as he drove away, leaving Matthews standing alone in the flashing red and blue lights, the officer knew this wasn't just another routine stop. This was the night he had been put in his place. Officer Ryan Matthews stood motionless, his fingers twitching at his sides as Darius's taillights disappeared into the distance. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the sinking feeling in his gut. He had been stripped of the authority he had always taken for granted. No badge, no gun, no amount of intimidation had mattered against a man like that. Darius Cole had walked away, not because he was afraid, but because he had already won. Matthews exhaled shakily, his breath unsteady. He had always believed himself untouchable, yet here he was, standing in the middle of an empty highway, exposed for exactly what he was, a coward in a uniform. The distant hum of an approaching vehicle pulled Matthews from his daze. He straightened his posture, trying to shake off the lingering humiliation, but his heart sank when he recognized the squad car pulling up behind him. It was his precinct's senior officer, Lieutenant Charles Monroe, a man with years of experience, known for his fairness and intolerance toward corruption within the force. The moment Monroe stepped out of his car and saw the way Matthews was standing there, stiff and shaken, his sharp gaze narrowed. What the hell happened here? His voice carried the weight of authority that Matthews had only ever tried to imitate. Matthews hesitated, his pride battling with the reality of the situation. He could lie. He could twist the story, make himself look like the victim. But as Monroe stepped closer, his eyes scanning the road, the flashing lights, the tension in the air, Matthews knew the truth was already written all over his face. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I pulled over a driver," he muttered, keeping his voice neutral. "Routine stop." Monroe arched an eyebrow, unimpressed. "And?" Matthews struggled to find an answer that wouldn't incriminate him further. He resisted, he finally said, though even he knew how weak the words sounded. Monroe studied him for a long moment before exhaling, shaking his head. Do you have any idea who that man was?" His voice wasn't angry, but there was a dangerous edge to it. Matthews frowned, his shoulders stiff. "Just another driver," he muttered. Monroe's expression darkened. That driver was a Navy SEAL. A war hero. A man who has served this country with more honor than you have in your entire career. The words hit Matthews like a punch to the gut. His stomach twisted as Monroe took another step closer. "And you pulled him over. For what? Because he looked suspicious? Because you thought you could throw your weight around and get away with it?" The accusation hung in the air, undeniable. Matthews opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. He knew there was nothing he could say to fix this. Monroe sighed, rubbing his temple as if he had already dealt with too many officers like him before. "You think your badge makes you powerful, Matthews? It doesn't. It's meant to represent trust, integrity, and responsibility. But tonight, you didn't act like an officer. You acted like a thug with a uniform." Matthews felt his face burn with shame. He had spent his career believing himself untouchable, believing that as long as he held the badge he could do as he pleased. But now, standing in front of his superior, exposed and defenseless, he realized how wrong he had been. Monroe exhaled deeply, his decision made. "You're being suspended, effective immediately. Internal Affairs will review this incident, and depending on what they find, you might not be wearing that badge much longer." Matthew's breath hitched. This wasn't just a warning. This was the beginning of the end. He had spent years wielding power carelessly, but now the weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. As Monroe turned and walked back toward his car, Matthews remained frozen in place, staring at the asphalt beneath him. For the first time, he understood what it felt like to be truly powerless. Officer Ryan Matthews stood frozen, his heart pounding as Lieutenant Monroe's words sank in. Suspended. The reality of it hit him like a brick to the chest. His entire career, everything he had built his identity around, was now hanging by a thread. He had never thought twice about pulling someone over for no reason, never questioned the way he treated certain people differently. It was just how things worked, how he had always done things. But tonight, all of that had changed. The man he had tried to intimidate, the man he had assumed was just another nobody, had left him standing here with nothing but regret. Matthews had spent years believing power came from control, from fear. But tonight, he had come face to face with a man who truly held power, and he had never felt smaller in his life. Monroe sighed as he watched Matthews struggle to process what had just happened. There was no sympathy in his expression, only disappointment. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, shaking his head. "That man wasn't just some driver you could push around. He's someone who has dedicated his life to serving this country, protecting people like you. And you disrespected him like he was nothing." Monroe stepped closer, his voice firm but calm. "You weren't enforcing the law tonight, Matthews. You were abusing it." The words stung. Matthews had always seen himself as someone who upheld the law, someone who deserved respect simply because he wore a badge. But the truth was undeniable. He had treated Darius like he was beneath him, without knowing a single thing about him. And now he was paying the price. The night air felt heavier as Matthews glanced at the flashing lights of his own patrol car. He had pulled over countless people, issued orders, demanded compliance, expected submission. But when Darius had looked him in the eye, completely unshaken, he had felt something foreign. Doubt. That man hadn't needed a badge to command respect. He had it simply because of who he was. The difference between them was clear. Matthews had used his uniform as a shield, a tool to make himself feel important. Darius, on the other hand, was important, with or without a title. And for the first time, Matthews realized how weak he looked in comparison. A deep silence stretched between him and Monroe before the lieutenant spoke again. "You want to know the worst part about all of this?" His voice was quieter now, almost tired. Matthews swallowed hard, unsure if he really wanted the answer. Monroe didn't wait. You had a choice. You could have done the right thing. You could have treated him with respect from the start, and none of this would have happened. He gestured toward the empty highway, but you didn't. You let your pride, your prejudice, make the decision for you. And now you're standing here, facing the consequences. Matthews felt his jaw tighten. It wasn't just his job on the line, it was his entire sense of self. For years, he had believed his authority was what made him strong. But now, standing here with his career slipping through his fingers, he realized he had never been strong at all. Monroe sighed, turning toward his patrol car. "Go home, Matthews. Think about what kind of man you want to be, because right now, you're not one I'd trust to wear that badge." With that, he climbed into his vehicle and drove off, leaving Matthews standing alone on the dark highway. The weight of the night settled on his shoulders as he stared at the ground, his mind reeling. He had spent years believing he was the one in control, the one who dictated how things played out. But tonight, he had learned a harsh truth. Real power didn't come from force. It came from respect. And respect was something he had never truly earned. Ryan Matthews stood in the middle of the empty highway, staring at the flashing lights of his patrol car, as Lieutenant Monroe's words echoed in his head. "Go home. Think about what kind of man you want to be." He had never thought about that before. He had spent years believing his badge made him important, that authority was something given rather than earned. But tonight had shattered that illusion. Darius Cole had walked away with his head high, his dignity untouched, while Matthews was left standing in the ruins of his own arrogance. He had spent his career making others feel powerless, yet tonight, he was the one who had been truly powerless. As he finally climbed into his squad car, he gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't over. His suspension would lead to an investigation, and the truth of his actions would be exposed. But for the first time, he didn't feel anger about it. He felt something else. Shame. He thought about Darius, about the quiet strength in the way he carried himself, the effortless control he had over the situation, without ever needing to raise his voice or show aggression. Matthews had mistaken that kind of strength for weakness his entire life. But now, sitting alone in his car, he realized that he was the weak one. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to change. Some people think power is about control, but real power, the kind that lasts, is about respect. And respect is something you earn, not something you take. Do you think this officer deserved a second chance? Let us know in the comments. If this story made you think, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. See you in the next one.